Welcome back to our video series about Soviet revisionism, in which we try to understand what really happened in the Soviet Union after Stalin. Did the political course of Khrushchev bring about stability and wealth, or did he betray socialism and restore capitalism? In the last episode, we investigated the Soviet economy and found that the answer to that question might not neatly fit into one of these two categories. We concluded that despite right opportunist deviations, the Soviet economy had still remained essentially socialist. In today's episode, we will take a look at the USSR's political system. Restorationists often argue that Khrushchev and Brezhnev had consciously decreased the percentage of workers in the CPSU. That is false. However, the intelligentsia was heavily overrepresented ever since the 1940s, when the Stalin administration decided to favor highly educated people over workers in the recruitment for new members. The mistake of Khrushchev and Brezhnev lies in that they never undertook meaningful measures to reverse this technocratic distortion. Despite this, the CPSU remained a tool for the involvement of workers in economic and political decision-making. The enterprise branches of the Communist Party were mainly comprised of production workers, and around 20 to 25% of industrial workers in major enterprises were likely to be party members. The Enterprise Party Committee had to ratify the appointment of administrative personnel, and a committee consisting of the party branch, the Young Communist League, and union representatives evaluated the work of management. This committee could transfer, reward, or even remove administrative personnel. The role of trade unions in the Soviet Union was ambiguous. On the one hand, even anti-communist sources admit that they were responsible for a broad range of social services and played a significant role in the protection of workers' interests and in production decisions. Unlike often powerless unions in capitalist countries, the responsibilities of Soviet trade unions included settling conflicts between workers and management, negotiating wages with the state, using enterprise funds to build communal facilities, and much more. Trade union district committees could sack each member of management, and they reportedly made use of this right. Through trade unions, employees could directly influence matters of their workplace, giving them participatory possibilities and considerable political power. Their institutional role did not diminish under Khrushchev or Brezhnev. On the other hand, it's true that unions felt obliged to represent state interests and to facilitate plan fulfillment. For this purpose, they often let directors' violations of workers' rights slip. But as mentioned in the previous episode, this might even have been in the interest of the workers, insofar as it allowed them to receive bonus payments that came with plan fulfillment. The heart of the Soviet political system were Soviets on multiple levels of government. They combined legislative and executive powers so that the deputies that were elected by the people could be held responsible for the changes they decided on. Deputies' mandates were imperative, which means that the people could recall them for not acting in their interest. Although it was rather rare, even members of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR could be recalled. Usually, one candidate per constituency was eligible for the post of deputy after he or she had been determined by public deliberations. On election day, the candidate had to receive at least 50% of votes to make it to the Soviet. If a candidate received less, the election process had to be repeated. But this rarely happened. Candidates did not have to be members of the Communist Party, and at times the majority of elected deputies weren't even party members. It's also worth mentioning some other institutions that enabled the people to exert their influence. The directly elected people's control groups, for example, were responsible for checking on economic performance of enterprises and for enforcing state law, as well as addressing workers' complaints. Such groups or committees existed on all levels of government and were a tool of the people to check on the administration. Even more important than that might have been the Soviet press. Newspapers regularly received numerous letters from the people with complaints about societal grievances, such as the misdemeanor of party and state officials. Newspapers were obliged to reply to each letter and to either investigate the matter themselves or to forward it to the responsible institutions. Often, they gave legal advice. In any case, the author of a letter had to be informed about what had been done to correct the matter of his or her complaints. The political system stayed pretty much the same after Stalin, and although it wasn't inherently undemocratic, it did suffer from the general political stagnation under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Looking at the institutional level alone, it cannot be claimed that Stalin's successors systematically reduced the rights of the working people to participate in politics. It is true, however, that Soviet politics underwent qualitative changes. Although Khrushchev and Brezhnev did not restrict fundamental rights, the actual participation of the people was gradually limited by a process of bureaucratization. Restorationists would argue that this was a deliberate attempt to concentrate the power in the hands of the new capitalist class. However, another explanation seems more plausible. As the Soviet economy grew bigger and more complex, the need for professional knowledge increased. This affected the people's deputies, who lost their influence to the Soviet's executive committees and who had their role reduced to giving formal approval to decisions made by these technocratic executives. Processes became formalized, and critique and initiative from the deputies was less and less welcome. It's a serious right opportunist mistake if one fails to elevate the people to a point where it can manage itself without relying on a technocratic strata. Let's take a look at some more undemocratic flaws that stem from the revisionism of Khrushchev and his successors. Criticism of the socialist system in general and personal attacks against its top officials were prohibited. This was mostly a reaction to the fact that the Soviet Union had to defend itself against Western destabilization attempts. However, this method is only second-rate compared to thoroughly inspiring and developing the revolutionary consciousness of the masses, as well as structurally eradicating elements of society that would side with the imperialists. But as this is criticism on a high level, the historic use of certain undemocratic measures in this regard seems justifiable from a Soviet perspective. A second point of criticism often mentioned in liberal critique of socialism are the harsh restrictions on emigration and travel in the Soviet Union. There are two aspects to this matter. On the one hand, since Khrushchev and Brezhnev were unable to inspire the people with socialist ideals and instead promoted a desire for material comfort, it was clear that they had to act against people leaving the country for economic reasons. This is a consequence that stems from a right opportunist error. On the other hand, even if the Soviet Union did not have to restrict the mass emigration of people, there would have likely been restrictions on travel into capitalist countries, since it would have enabled foreign spy activity and consequently posed a security threat. To sum it up, our findings are ambiguous, but at least that makes them consistent with our economic analysis. Khrushchev and Brezhnev did not fundamentally change the Soviet Union's political system, and certainly not in the interest of some form of capitalism. However, through political stagnation, the system degenerated in the direction of a technocratic dictatorship. In the next episode, we will take a deep dive into the Soviet Union's foreign relations. In particular, we will deal with the question of Soviet social imperialism.